Welcome to the Discerning Faith Podcast. I am Daryl.
I am Nathan.
And we're going to continue our walk through the Bible and the books of the Bible. Just kind of a quick overview of each one. Last week, we walked through Deuteronomy and Joshua.
Deuteronomy and Joshua. With repetition.
Yes. So Deuteronomy was all about repetition. We talked about the Shema and teaching the next generation. And then Joshua, we kind of got into how they were kind of conquering the land and getting in God's provision through that. And
Rough start, but ended up going all right by the end.
fairly faithful by the end. So that's good.
And a full generation of faithfulness. That will surely continue on.
Absolutely. But now we're in Judges. So not so much.
Yeah.
So you want to do the recap to set the stage?
Yeah, so the beginning of Judges kind of goes into the end of Joshua, some of the particular conquests that they do. And it sets the stage that there were still conquests yet that remained. Kind of these lands that have these foreign gods that were going to eventually prove a test for the Israelites. And unfortunately, these tests are going to show time and time again that man is typically unfaithful toward God. And we tend to stray after these false idols and these other ways of worship and just not following God the way he wants to be, or following after things that aren't God in general. And so, looking at Judges 2:20 through 22, we see this really play out. The anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he said, "Because this nation has transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and has not heeded my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, so that through them I may test Israel to know whether they will keep the ways of the Lord, to walk in them as their fathers kept them, or not."
Yeah.
And so they're about to go through a testing period, and it's mostly going to go poorly. We see the cycle of they turn away from God. And so God and his righteousness and his justice brings judgment upon them by some kind of oppressive outside force and nation. And people eventually realize, oh, dang, we done screwed up, and they repent, they cry out to God, and God will raise up for them a judge and will deliver them from their oppressors, and the people will serve the Lord faithfully for pretty much as long as the judge is around, and then once they're gone, the people falter away again.
Right.
And again, and again, and again.
And that cycle is sometimes a little bit better, sometimes a little worse. And then, the faithfulness that comes with the judge.
Yes.
And the judge themselves, whether they're overly faithful or not.
Yeah.
God does bring them up as in physical deliverance every time, but not always as much the spiritual deliverance because of the lack of obedience.
Yes.
Still. So this is kind of a dark period of the Israelites,
Especially toward the end.
and it gets only worse, at least throughout Judges. And so, it's kind of from a guy's perspective, especially a younger guy, when you first kind of come upon the Judges, like, oh, this is one of the most exciting books in the Bible. There's all this killing and
Killing.
Yeah, killing. But it is kind of an interesting read. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
And I don't say that to be, I don't want to trivialize the death and
Yes.
people walking away from God, because that's terrible. But it is one of the times that you kind of are like, oh, wow, this is, for lack of a better term, it would make a good movie, And so it is somewhat exciting. Yeah. And so it can be kind of a little bit easier to enter into somewhat than the law passages sometimes. Now, I'm not saying we should not do that. We should be in the law. We should understand the law. We should love the law.
Yes.
But these are a little easier to, I think, somewhat. But I think, therefore, sometimes we can miss the points as well.
Yes.
My favorite judge probably is Ehud. And it's actually, there's not much to the story of Ehud. I mean, it's one of the shorter ones. But I like the fact that he's left-handed, and they're like, oh, he can't ever be left-handed. That's not going to be a thing. And then the big fat Eglon who, eats the sword with his fat belly, but, while he's on the toilet. Yes, while he's on the toilet. I mean, it is interesting. And I think I like Ehud because I see him as a very just faithful and strong leader.
Yeah.
He just goes and does what needs to be done. And he's prude about it. Like, he's prudence. That's it. He's wise. Not willing, the dude's on the toilet. But anyway. But you know, he's wise in the way that he doesn't.
Yes.
He doesn't just go and go, I'm gonna conquer you. Like he, you know, there's something to this subterfuge is really good and interesting.
Yeah, so there's a lot of the early judges are pretty much completely positive. We have Othniel, who is Caleb, as we talked about, one of the faithful spies from last time. His nephew, Othniel, is the first judge that is listed. Mm-hmm. He is obedient to God as well. We have Deborah, but isn't the Bible all patriarchal and oppressive and this, that, and the other? No, Deborah also is one of the judges of Israel. She calls a particular male leader to step up and go and kind of lead the command armies, essentially, to drive out the oppressors. His name is Barak, and he says, well, I'll do it, but only if you go with me. And then she says, well, I'll go with you, but you're going to lose a lot of your glory to a woman because of this. Ironically, he loses it to two women because another one actually assassinates the leaders of the foreign army. So
Her name is Jael, Jael, I think.
she drives a tent spike through it, and it says,
Yeah, once again, we're going to go back to, we talked about when we were going through this deep dive of like the different books. If the Bible were made into a movie, it would be rated pretty highly, like R, if not, depending on some other.
NC-17.
Yes, it's crazy. And I think with Jael, it's even that she's almost like seducing him as part of the. No, I don't think that's right.
No, not at that one. She's just like comforting him because Radish was battered. And they're just lay here.
Go to sleep. And boom. So, but, you know, there's a lot of craziness and it's going to get worse here, especially here in Judges. So Othniel, Ehud, and Deborah are all pretty positive. I think Deborah's actually one of the longer passages.
Yes.
Othniel and Ehud.
There's a song of hers as well recorded in there.
Yeah.
We have some short mentions which are scattered throughout the book, so we'll go back and make a point about that toward the end. But just know that there are some other guys like Shamgar and Tola who have like 3 sentences about them each. So we got a whole lot of detailed, either positive wording of it's just they were there.
This is what happened. Yeah. So next, though, we go into Gideon, who is mostly positive. He's kind of a coward at first because he's threshing his grain indoors, which is something you don't do. I don't know. I'm not, but I'm told you don't do that.
But it's dangerous out there.
And does pretty well after he realizes that God's in charge and he's just going to follow him. But he does set up an idol and has 70 sons by many wives, which is never a good idea. Solomon, which leads to major fratricide by I can't remember what fratricide is.
Killing of your siblings.
Yeah. Okay.
So essentially one of the sons is like, hey, by the way, all you other leaders, all the other elders of people, would you rather be ruled by 70 guys from this guy's son, or from Gideon, or would you rather just have one guy, me, follow me, and we'll kill all my brothers? And they do, and then God actually put it, except for one, and then that one escapes, and then God eventually punishes Abimelech for the murder that he committed. So, yeah. So essentially, Gideon did mostly good, but he set up some things that had some poor history for the nation afterwards. So, yeah. Moving on to Jephthah. Hopefully I'm pronouncing this right. We have 4 consonants in a row. It gets a little bit confusing, but we have a mostly positive report from him. He does not have a wonderful lineage. His mother was a harlot, and he was shunned by his brothers and all that jazz. But the people are oppressed, and after being shunned by essentially all the people, they come to him and say, hey, you help us out. Well, you guys shunned me. Why should I do that? We will make you our leader. Okay. We've heard some accounts of him that say that he didn't really walk with God or whatever, but it talks about when he actually tries to negotiate with the oppressors, like, okay, why are you guys attacking us also? What's going on here? Well, you guys stole our land. And Jephthah corrects this and says, no, we didn't steal your land. When we were going about our wanderings, we dealt with these other people, and they're the ones who stole your land, but they also stole stuff from us, and God gave them to us to conquer, and so we conquered them, and your land was part of what we conquered, but we did not take from you. This is not a righteous thing that you're doing to us. They reject his negotiation anyway, and so he wages war on them. good for him in his obedience. He also does a dumb thing by promising. I don't even know what his mindset, like, what were you reasonably expecting? He promises a vow to God that I will sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my door when I come back home. Were you expecting a goat or a cow or something to open the door? Like, what were you expecting? No, it's his virgin daughter. So he said, well, I have to kill her now, which I'll say I don't think that was the right call either. I think that the better call would be to renege on that and probably take the punishment for God for yourself rather than commit human sacrifice, because God does not like human sacrifice. That's the greater sin.
Yeah.
But still, he sacrifices his daughter anyway, kind of foolishly. We read in the chapter afterward, he has to deal with a little bit of civil war with the tribe of Ephraim, who, well, you didn't include us when you were trying to conquer these people, so we're going to burn your house down. Yeah, because that's a reasonable response to any of this. No, Ephraim was too stupid here. So, mostly positive in his obedience and his kind of Christ from his status, his knowledge of the history of God's people. Those are positives, but also a really, really dumb oath. Like, why?
Yeah. I mean, basically, who would come out of your door? Your wife, your children, and a beloved pet. Probably. I mean, it's not like you probably had the goats outside or the cows.
Maybe he really didn't like his wife.
Maybe that's open. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So
it's just, that's one of those things where it's like, why?
And maybe it was just to give him a little bit of that. Maybe he was just in his zeal for, give me the victory, Lord, and I'll do this. And he's, excited about trying to fulfill what God wants him to do. Still is foolish.
Yes.
Speaking of which, so before we move to that part, I think we'll go ahead and talk about, so there's a lot of resources I talked about last time, really high resources out there that can be really good. We talked about one YouTube channel, another one that I kind of tend to go to, but you have to do it with a grain of salt. So if you're new in the faith and don't know the word well, I would say probably stay away from their resources. But if you have a little bit more discernment as you've grown in the Lord, it might be okay, but just tread very lightly. But there is, I don't know if you guys have ever heard about the Bible Project. You guys may have heard of that. They do explainer videos is what I think they call them, where they kind of draw out and they kind of talk about, and they've done what we're doing here.
We're condensed.
Yes. Yeah. And the way they do it is actually really well done, I think. I mean, it's very talented, very well done. It's very, like, the way they put it on the screen is really helpful, visually appealing, but also helpful that I get the information from it. And this chapter is this, and, they really break it down well. However, there is a leading that, if I'm honest, whenever I listen to their stuff, I'm always kind of like, I don't know, there's just something off. I don't know if you guys have ever had that. But so, for instance, here specifically with Jephthah, first of all, he describes him as a base mob boss. And the only thing I think he got that from is when I read it said something about he fell in with men of ill repute or something along those lines. Like, okay.
Yeah, but he's a sort of a harlot exercised from society.
So he might not have much choice.
Yeah, so...
but then they also said that he didn't have anything to do with following the Lord, but yet he knew the history of Israel, so that's a good start. So I think that was, at best, conjecture, if not reading something into it that's not there.
They also, I think you said that they essentially justify Ephraim rather than Jephthah after the conquest. And it's like, the guys who threatened to burn down the guy's house for no good reason are probably not the good guys in this side of the dispute here.
But I would say if you want something that's quick and condensed, you can listen to ours about the books of the Bible. You can listen to theirs, but just deal with the grain of salt.
They also do have a tendency not to pretty much downplay or almost apologize for any sort of violence that happens in the Bible, which there's a lot of this book.
Yeah.
But even in Joshua or whatnot, where if there's violence, it must at least be at best a necessary evil, but it's probably just not a good thing. And they almost try to walk back what God has commanded and the judgment and consequences for wickedness that God has brought about. And so you gotta be kind of careful with them. also heard in recent days that recent years, they may have outlawed some other questionable,
Yeah.
So just be careful who you get information from.
Yeah, that's the bigger point, is not to necessarily dog on one specific, because again, I think I've had some things that they've really helped me understand a little better in the word, and also just wrestle with. Sometimes getting information from someone who you don't agree with helps you really understand your position, or even maybe challenges something that may not be good in one. So, but just everything that even us, again, we'll say this, go back to the word, talk with other people that you know that are godly, that want the right thing, and we're going to be wrong sometimes. Shocker.
Yes.
I know. But we are going to be wrong sometimes. So verify. Trust, but verify.
Test the spirit.
Test the spirit. So speaking of foolishness, next is Samson. Now, this is funny. I loved the stories of Samson growing up. They were just so fun to me. Ripping off a donkey's jawbone, a donkey's jawbone.
Avengers is a little Firefox.
But really, Samson is mostly negative. He's just kind of, he makes me think of the jock who's drawn by every passion. He seems to like drink. He seems to like honey, and he likes women a lot. And so, I mean, in some ways, he's relatable as a man. But he's also just stupid too.
Yes. And you got to remember, he was called out from before he was born that he was going to serve God. He was going to be a judge. He was called to an extra bit of standard where his parents were told that this is going to be a Nazarite for life, which means that, pardon me, he has certain restrictions, like he can't be around certain dead things, as we talked about before. Alcohol, and included in that is kind of honey and fermenting things, not allowed to be around,
not allowed to cut his hair,
relationship with women, if you haven't noticed. These are all things he violates. Multiple times with his poor choices with women, he has anger issues. He ate honey, as we talked about, out of the carcass of the lion, which one is also a dead thing, and two, I don't think lions were clean animals anyway, so add a fifth violation while we're at it here. He is a giant mess of poor, foolish decisions, sins, and just breaking and staying away from the exact path that he was supposed to go down as this judge of Israel. But that does not mean that he never did anything right in that. And then there again, sometimes some people say, even in his final act of vengeance, on the Philistines, that he did wrong. No.
So at the end of his life, as most of you are probably aware who have read the story, is they had put out his eyes and blinded him brutally, just to be fair. And they put him up between two pillars in a temple or meeting place. I feel like it was a temple, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a temple, but it was kind of ones that they did for entertainment purposes as well. He was essentially going to be their court jester while they were there.
They were basically there to mock him and laugh at him. And I think, I don't remember how explicitly, again, I haven't read these stories specifically in a while, but I know that he's kind of at a point where it's like, what do I do? Do I just kind of live out my days, or I can literally push down, because he had lost his strength, because as soon as his hair was cut, he loses his strength. And that was just the way God worked that out. And so he had lost his strength, and he basically prays to God and says, give me one more chance. And so he pushes the temple down, essentially on top of all of it,
pushes out the support beams, and everything comes crashing down.
And so it even says specifically, or explicitly, that he kills more Philistines in that one act than he did in all the other wrathful things that he did before. And it's probably more impactful because it's a lot of leadership of the Philistines. And so God used him in spite of all of his wickedness and flaws. God uses him to deliver the people of Israel. But another just take on that is, in the Bible Project, they talk about how, that was an act of mass murder. And it's like,
nope, it was mass justice by God.
Yeah. murder is killing without cause.
Killing unrighteous.
Unrighteous, right? Without a good cause or unrighteous. That's a better way to put it. And that was not what happened there. That was God's judgment through Samson. And again, I think that's why you have to be really careful. And we have to understand sin for what it is. We have to understand all of this. So anyway.
Yeah.
So there's Samson. Kind of maybe somewhat of a small redeeming factor there at the end. But yeah. So
as we talked about before, there were also a bunch of quick mention ones. Shagmar, Tola, Jer, Isbon, Elon Musk, Abdon. Quite a few guys who have quick mentions here and there throughout, and we don't really see much positive or negative. It's just they're there. As far as we know, they were just faithful. They were there, and it's like, okay, they judged Israel, so we assume at least some level of faithfulness. And those guys, because they kind of spread out throughout, kind of there's a view that essentially everything that judges slowly gets worse and worse and worse. And you get that feeling with the ones that have multiple chapters laid out for them. Like, yes, things seem to be getting worse, but these guys are also sprinkled in. And I think we overlook and also neglect their faithfulness and God's testimony and work in Israel through them. Like, we don't have a lot of information, but from what we have, like, they were faithful to God as well. And so let's not discredit that.
It's not like in Kings of Chronicles where it has the list of the kings. It says either they were faithful in God's eyes, which is very rare. It's more that they were evil in the eyes of the Lord. We don't have that. It's just here they were. Here's maybe a blurb about what they did. And that's all we know.
And they judged Israel for this long time. So it's, again, making sure that we don't either read out or read into Scripture things we want to see just to have we want to see a particular pattern, like things are getting worse and worse and worse. Make sure that we actually take the word from what it says, all of it, as a whole, and use that for our understanding of Scripture.
Yep. Yeah. And as a little bit of foreshadowing, the final judgment will be mentioned later. We're going to go to another book and then he'll be in the next one. And he ends up, ironically, being probably the best overall and most faithful throughout all of his time of judging Israel. And so, a theme of Judges is widespread sin and wickedness. Judges 17:6 says, and I think it says this multiple times throughout Judges, and we have two different spots here, but Judges 17:6 says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
But what could be right in their own eyes? Clearly people are good, and there couldn't be horrible things that would happen in the last couple books or chapters of Judges here.
People are not good. The Bible's pretty clear about that. So things that you end up will read about in the end of Judges here is idolatry, even by the priesthood, which is especially egregious, of course, if the priests are doing it.
Yeah.
Harlotry, gang rape leading to murder, bodily dismemberment, protecting criminals, civil war, and kidnapping. So it's pretty bad.
It's kind of darker. Like, what on earth are they thinking? Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There was no leadership. And so it repeats the verse that we just said there at the end, and chapter 21, verse 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
Yeah.
I kind of have an aside. I think sometimes we, as you do read into First Samuel and the king gets set up and everything, I think we sometimes they asked for a king wickedly. There was no good reason to ask for a king. One, God told them back in Moses' time, you're going to have a king eventually, and here's how the king should serve me. So this wasn't unexpected by God, and God had plans for how a king should behave righteously anyway. So one, it's not like this is some unexpected request. Two, the need for essential leadership, particularly politically, is important because we see how horrible things get without some kind of authority to guide people.
This was like the division or chaos.
Yes. And so as much as there are reasons we're wrong for asking for a king and wanting to be like everyone else, there was good reason to ask for a king, because when there wasn't a king, everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and sin abounded horribly because of that. So those two verses are also a reminder that, one, not to look down our leadership, and two, not to make sure you take, as we talked about before, Scripture as a whole in context. Again, well, at least screwed up in asking for a king. Not wholly. In part they did, but not wholly did they screw up in asking king there. So
So the key verse here for Judges is Judges 2:18-19. And when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed them and harassed them. And it came to pass when the judge was dead that they reverted and behaved more corruptly than their fathers. Again, there is at least some idea that there was some proliferation because more corruptly.
Yeah.
But it's not expressly written throughout the book.
right.
By their fathers, by following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not cease from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way.
And it's the pattern we see over and over, both in the time of the Judges and then as we continue forward as well into other books. So,
So that wraps up Judges.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'll kind of move into, I believe, someone's favorite book.
Maybe before.
So
They go to my favorite book, Ruth. So Ruth takes place sometime during the time of the Judges. We don't have an exact timeline when. Theoretically, we could kind of guesstimate a little bit because at the end of the book, there's a little bit of lineage again. But the end of Judges doesn't really list a time frame of how long it's taken all these events to go. So we don't know exactly when. We just know it's sometime during the time of the Judges, which tells us things are generally not good in the area, typically speaking.
Yeah.
And so during it, a family from the tribe of Judah leaves to go to Moab, who is not a nation looked upon highly by God at all, in the least bit. But they leave because there's a famine in the land, and they kind of settle in there. The patriarch family dies. His two sons marry some foreign women, but the sons also died. All of them are dead. Only the women left.
So the one of the very Moabites is right.
Yeah.
Milan.
Yeah. And so the matriarch of the family, Naomi / Mara, as she's known by both names throughout the book, decides, okay, it's time to go back home. Thank you, daughter-in-laws, for staying with me and for being there for my sons and all, but you should go to your own households, remarry into your own people, and take part in your life there as well. So,
which is her way of trying to protect them, because she knows that in Israel, a Moabitess woman, especially a widow, was probably going to be poor off.
Yes.
So
one of them does. One of them decides to be very clingy. Very, very clingy. No, it's a incredible testimony to Ruth, who essentially forsakes all. She forsakes her family. She forsakes the gods of her land, their people, their culture, and she joins to the people of God and thereby to God as well, for the sake of her mother-in-law. And kind of a verse that highlights her character here. Chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. But Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me." It's an incredible sacrifice and a testimony to her character and to the work that God is obviously doing in her life to some part and degree. It's not really clear how much she may have worked on her while they were in the land of Moab, or if this is a transformation that kind of takes place on the way there with this declaration. It's not clearly stated, but there's obviously some sort of work that God is doing and stirring up in her during the story. So,
yeah. So then we'll bring in Boaz. So Boaz is an Israelite person. Someone in
he's an Israelite person.
Yes. He's a man of character and means. So, and he actually happens to be somehow related to Naomi, right? And so that's important because of the kinsman redeemer.
And she's also related as far as familial ties to Naomi. He is also, and as we learned from the genealogies later on, I think it's in Matthew, is this particular one. He is the son of Rahab. And so
really the timeline doesn't seem like that work out. That's interesting.
Yeah, people lived long, and then there was weird things through all that. So It also makes sense because, as a hint, it's hinted at, it's never explicitly stated, but he is an older man during this time. It's hinted at. We don't really have the passage here, but there's an age gap between he and Ruth to some degree, so it's not unreasonable. Like, oh, who would ever marry a guy like his age? But there's at least enough ones like, it would have made sense for you to marry someone much younger by, and spoiler alert, they would get married. But for now, we're just kind of beating him and knowing that he introduces himself with a line that it's the line I sign off with. The Lord be with you and bless you. It is kind of combination of the greeting that he gives his workers. It's a standard greeting, but it's so ingrained that they just know, and this is how they respond to each other, but it's one that apparently means something to them. But he's also a man of means who can actually provide, and that's something not to be looked down upon either. We can think, rich people out, and they're obviously evil. They, one of possessions is going to face temptations and all this thing, and they're probably got their wealth by ill gain and this, that, and the other. That makes it clear that those with wealth are to take care of others with, also probably can get to enjoy it to some degree, but it's kind of a duty and, again, an additional stewardship by God to take care of other people with as well. And he is very clearly the type of guy to do that.
So, well, he's faithful to follow something in the law, which was to leave some of his grain behind so that the poor and the widows could glean from that grain.
Yes.
And he does that, and that's how Ruth comes into the picture with him.
Mm-hmm. She's looking to provide for her and Naomi, and so she goes to find a field to glean from, and he takes care of her. He actually goes above and beyond, and how he takes care of her. He instructs his young men not to harass her in any way. She gets to hang out with his women because, essentially, including her, you're not a foreign woman at this point. You are part of the people. We'll get to that a little bit with the key verse that we brought up here, but really incorporating her into the nation of Israel with that. Like, no, you are equivalent, equal ground with all of our young women here. He treats her extra well at the mealtime that they share together during harvest, which is something we're not really familiar with, but they're getting during harvest time, like the workers and the boss would essentially share and partake and essentially keep topped off on their own energy reserves as they're getting more and more food. And he instructed his workers to leave extra for knockoffs on the ground for her to be able to gather up. And so he does not only what the law requires, but above and beyond to take care of her without expecting anything in return at this point, other than it's just his own character. It's who he is to do this and to take care of her. So,
yeah, absolutely. It's kind of interesting because this whole idea that kinsman redeemer is just foreign to us. But at one point, Naomi says to Ruth, "Hey, this is our best shot. He is related to us. Go." Well, first she tells her to stop dressing as a widow because there was a certain dress that came with the widow. So dress and show him that you're available, essentially. Now, this is no weird, like harlotry type thing. It's just, right. It's just, in general, it's kind of like if you were still wearing your ring as a widow, take the ring off and show that you're available, right? And then, so Ruth is always faithful and does. And then at one time she goes to him and basically it's kind of in the middle of the night, which is weird.
Yeah.
It kind of startles him, but then she basically says, "Are you going to do what you're supposed to do? Because you're the kinsman redeemer." So do you want to explain what a kinsman redeemer is?
Yeah, so it's kinsman redeemer has three essentially different roles in scripture. One, it's the same word, the exact same term and person as the blood avenger. It doesn't really come up on this particular story, but it's worth noting that someone who is a kinsman redeemer to bring people out of bad situations must also be willing to punish evildoers who commit atrocities against his family as well. And so, in this case, the blood avenger part doesn't come as part in this particular story for his duties, but it would also be his duty if it came about. As far as I always think of the redeemer part, there are two other parts. One, the kinsman redeemer could buy property that a relative had sold to cover a debt or something like that. And the kinsman redeemer would be able to buy it from the person who purchase the property at the same value. So essentially the property stays in the family, and it makes it easier for the family to get the piece of property, land, whatever it was, back and restored to the original owner. Because again, this kind of heritage and inheritance idea was really important, and we miss a lot of that these days as well. The final duty is the levirate marriage, which kind of talked a little bit about before, but it's we kind of brought it up with Judah, where if the guy dies without having an heir, without having a son or a daughter, I think it's typically, it may be specifically son, but it may not need to be a son. I don't remember off the top of my head right now. But without having a child of some description, the brother was supposed to marry the widow for the purposes of essentially raising an heir to take the brother's name and to pass on, again, that heritage, that legacy, so that his name would not be forgotten as well.
Well, this is where I think our modern minds get in the way, and we're like, what do you mean she has to marry this brother? And first of all, it's a different culture. This doesn't mean the same thing. But also, it was protection for that widow, because a widow at that time meant she doesn't have a way to take care of herself. You know, the man was the provider, and so without that, the widow may starve. And one of the big things in all of the laws was to take care of widows and orphans. But it's God's way of providing for that widow. And, you know, we see it now a lot of times like, well, oh, that's oppressive. She has to marry some other guy, this brother. But it's actually God's provision for her.
So there's a couple of different aspects. One, theoretically, if she's been incorporated into the family well, then she at least knows the guy. So it's not like you're marrying a complete stranger who's taking advantage of you. Theoretically, know something about this guy, his character and all that, and hopefully have some level of trust for him. Additionally, raises up a child, and again, this goes into honor your father and mother. This is kind of a continuation of that as well, because this child that was raised up then would be the one who would then more focus on providing for his mother at that point and taking care of her as child grew older and stronger and wiser and would have more means to take care of the parents. And that's, again, another thing we lose out in this culture is this relationship of taking care of, you know, not only the generation after you, but also the generation before you as well. And so in this case, Boaz was kind of operating off of both the property, using that cleverly because he knew the word and knew God's law and was wise and knew and how he could do it, as well as the levirate marriage part of the law as well. So she goes to ask him, and like, okay, you're the kinsman redeemer, so you're going to do it. Yes, and that was it. There's no controversy after that whatsoever. There was a controversy because there was someone who was closer who was technically supposed to do the duty first. However, Boaz shows not only his willingness to do it, but his desire to do it, knowing who Ruth is, knowing her character, knowing how God has worked in her. He wants to be the one to fulfill this for her. And so he essentially goes to the village gate where he gathers up the elders, and he finds Mr. So-and-so is the technical Hebrew phrase translation for the guy's name. And he calls him aside and says, okay, so our departed, I don't remember if it was Mahlon's property or if it was Naomi's husband's property. I think it was Naomi's husband's property originally is how he worded it. This needs to be redeemed for Naomi. You can purchase it if you want, so the property will be yours. Do you want to do that? Well, yeah, I like having to do the land. Sure, I'll purchase the land. And so he kind of gets him into a little bit of a, well, if you're wanting to do that, there's something that comes along with it as well. And so he then brings up, okay, if you're doing that, then you also have to marry Ruth to raise up an heir for Mahlon. I think it was her first husband's name, not pronounced anyway, to raise up an heir. And the guy backs out. It's a little bit confusing because there's some kind of inheritance laws that he's inferring here, but essentially Mr. So-and-so says, well, I can't do that because that's going to screw up something about his own inheritance, whether that's for his own name because he doesn't want to raise up a son who might, essentially blot out his own heritage, which Boaz wasn't even worried about. He was completely fine to abandon that and be like, nope, it'll be under Mahlon's name, and I'm fine with that because I will do this to Ruth. it could be that Mr. So-and-so was married, and so there was, and had other children, and so maybe that would cause family drama at home. We don't really know for certain. It doesn't say. But he essentially bails on well, because they're tied together now, the property purchase and the marriage of Ruth at the same time. And so because of that, Boaz is like, okay, in the hearing of these elders, I am going to fulfill the duty. I will buy the property, and I will have Ruth as my wife. Which is again interesting because he's willing to do that even at the risk of his own heritage, but we remember Boaz. We remember his name. He's the one that's listed in the line of David here, not Mahlon. And so ironically, the guy who was not worried about his heritage had his heritage preserved and honored even further by his act and all.
Something like the first will be last and last will be first. Or he who tries to save his life will lose it, but he who loses his life will save it. Something like that. No, that sounds like a similar concept.
Yeah. So it's an incredible story. It's one that's interesting because it's a love story. The word love's not listed in the book altogether, and so it's a short book. You can read it in 30 minutes. If you haven't read it already, then do that. After you hear this, just go ahead and just read it and understand what's going on with that.
Yeah, it's one of those interesting books in the Old Testament, kind of like Esther, where Esther, God mentioned it all. Spoiler alert, it's Esther. But even in the book of Ruth, God is mentioned, but it's more like, well, your God or this God. Or
yes.
It's God isn't represented as so really involved.
Yes.
Which is in the New Testament especially.
It's more the passive him being there rather than there's some kind of active event or force going on here that's like, okay, this is directly caused by God.
Mm-hmm. So, but also you see God's laws enacted, even though God's not, again, actively in the story, which I don't mean that to say just he's not mentioned in the same way. But God's laws to preserve for the redemption really of Naomi, Ruth, even Boaz to some extent, because he was the son of Rahab, who was incorporated people, but she was a harlot of Jericho, right, of one of the nations that they dispossessed. So he gets incorporated to the people from that, and yes, the dead who also get redeemed in this as well. So, but then Ruth and Boaz's son is Obed, who is the father of Jesse, who is the father of David, King David. And so very closely related to, the son of David, or the lineage of David, which then becomes the lineage of the Messiah, Jesus. And so, again, God kind of weaves all this together. It's really interesting. And again, in Ruth, you don't see him as an active slave, but he's very much active in it.
He works through people who are obedient to him. He works through people who sacrifice of themselves for him and to become part of his people. He is active through the laws and his word that he has already laid out and the good purpose that those have. And when they're fulfilled, so yeah, it doesn't seem like, it's not the fire coming down from the sky or something like that, but it is just as much God made a part of this story as he is in every other story that he is. So,
absolutely.
So, again, kind of probably got another key verse here, just to highlight both Boaz and Ruth's character in this, chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. And Boaz answered and said to her, "It has been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother in the land of your birth, and have come to a people who you did not know before. The Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." So again, God's still mentioned, but maybe not quite as active of a way. But again, just highlighting that one, Ruth's character is known, her sacrifice, her joining herself to the people of God, which is also an encouragement for us and for those who aren't yet part of the people of God, to follow Ruth's example, to leave all behind, to join and to come under the refuge of God and under his wings and his protection and his goodness, and to be joined to that. Well, also showing Boaz's understanding, his character, his appreciation for God as well. It's just a good, incredible story.
It really is. Yeah.
So, any final thoughts?
I don't have anything to add on that.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. This has been Discerning Faith. The Lord be with you and bless you.